Welcome once again to our Okta OIE Meetup series. Today's session is going to be a very special session. It's going to be more of a town hall session with our very special guest, Jon Lehtinen, the Senior Director of Okta on Okta. He's going to talk to us about Okta's own transition from Classic Engine to OIE, as well as our implementation of various OIE specific features, and talk a little bit about what Okta on Okta is, what its mission is, and all of that. Let's see, where did my screen go? There we go. All right. So as I mentioned, we're joined by our special guest today. First off, my name is Brent Arrington. I'm with the product acceleration team here at Okta. We're joined as always by my colleague Dimitri Volkman, who is part of our product marketing team. And again, our very special guest today is Jon Lehtinen, Senior Director of Okta on Okta. Who's going to be sharing some helpful insights with us today. Before we dive in, I do have to present the ubiquitous safe harbor statement. There may be forward-looking statements in today's presentation. And just before we dive into this, just to kind of set the stage, this is now, I think, the fourth in our series of OIE meetups. In the previous three, we've talked about use cases that have been addressed by or that are addressed by Okta Identity Engine, the use cases that can be accelerated by OIE, and we've talked about a number of the underlying features that support those use cases. In today's session, we're going to have a little bit of a different experience. We're going to have an opportunity to hear from a real-world practitioner about the actual challenges and opportunities and successes of implementing all of these use cases and features in OIE. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jon Lehtinen, Senior Director of Okta on Okta, to give us some background on what Okta on Okta is and what their mission entails before we dive into your audience questions. Jon, take it away.
Very good. Now, are we actually sharing content presently and I just don't see it, or?
I
yep, we are.
There we go.
Look at me, I'm such an amateur. All right, well, howdy, y'all. Thank you so much for attending, and please, to the extent that we can make this as interactive a session as possible for the kind of Q&A, I'd like to make sure we facilitate that. I think a lot of the value of these kind of sessions comes from a meeting of the minds, so to speak, of people who are ultimately accountable and have to do this day to day. So if nothing else, think about this as like a hallway conversation at a technical conference on tap, where just, whatever the ideas go, we're going to field them. So, and before, yep, go ahead.
Jon, I'm sorry, but let me interrupt you quickly before you get started. I should have mentioned before, just a logistic note here for your questions. As you have questions, as Jon's going through his initial presentation, please put those in the Q&A section in the Zoom Q&A. We have some moderators here on the line with us as well who are going to be curating your questions to bring those forward once we get to the later part of the presentation. So if you have questions, please place those there. We will get to them later in the presentation. Sorry about that, Jon. Please take it away.
Not a problem. All right, let's go on. So who are we, right? What is Okta and Okta? Next slide. Well, we're the people who actually own and do the delivery of identity services for Okta's own business needs here at Okta. So in that regard, we're very much like so many of our customers. In fact, we like to call ourselves our best and first customer. Not that the rest of you all aren't also equally best, but yeah, somebody's got to do this first. In terms of our environment, we have over 7,000 accounts that for employees and contractors. We are primarily, we were born in the cloud. We're a cloud first company. We have over 300 SaaS applications and over 1,200 app integrations in our tenant, generally speaking, once you factor for shortcuts and differing environments. We use workflows a lot. Workflows is the hammer that makes a lot of things a nail. And so we really like to use it for process automation and other security features. And we only have one authoritative source, which we use to populate our universal directory instance here at Okta, and that's Workday. So making sure that integration is tight, and we have all the employee and necessary business attributes to build business logic in our tenant is paramount. So next one, please. All right, so Okta and Okta, I mean, people can infer what we do here, but we have a sufficiently vague or generic, better said, mission that I'm sure a lot of you have in your own companies, which is, you want to deliver that best-in-class experience for your employees and customers. And rather, like that's an aspirational goal. And the way we look to fulfill that goal is through our 3 missions. And the very first of those is going to be the most familiar. Next slide. And that's the typical enablement of the business for identity services. We own our workforce implementations of the Okta platform for our commercial tenant, which is where we do our business, and also the federal tenant. And we also have launched the Okta and Okta CIC for customer use cases here at Okta. If you saw Octane virtually, you signed in through that tenant. And if you've seen the content after the fact, then you actually went through an FGA authorization process in addition through that tenant to determine if you get access or not. So this is in this regard, this is what every one of us has to deliver to our businesses, regardless what business our business is in. So what really makes Okta and Okta fun is not just do we have to be the IT practitioners using the Okta platform, we get to use that knowledge to then try to make it better. So our next mission is focused on that. Next slide, please. And that's evolving the product. So I'd already said that we try to position ourselves as our first and best customer. And the idea is we want to be the first people using and proving that these features are providing values. So that way we can demonstrate confidence in our platform and products to our customers. We partner deeply with our product and engineering teams to give feedback on what we need as a growing business. And then feedback all throughout the beta and early access process to file off those rough edges, file bug reports, and make it best. So in that way, we're not only just delivering the IT services, but ideally we're making the product better through that collaboration and partnership. And last but certainly not least, we have our final mission, which is, thank you, to showcase the platform. It's to talk shop. It's for us to make ourselves available to customers or people who are interested in Okta for their own use cases and want to find out how Okta uses it internally. It's not just, the gorgeous, but ultimately airheaded leaders of the organization who do this, but most of my staff, they engage in these customer conversations with fellow admins a lot, and it's always very productive. And whereas we're not support, we're not solutions architecture, we're always more than happy to geek out and spitball around whatever it is that you're looking at, especially if we've been there before. So next slide. And so in that regard, all these missions interlock. We get the insight on how to enable the business and how to evolve the product and the credibility to showcase it and give that feedback. And of course, that experience enabling the business allows us to showcase it in a way that hopefully doesn't feel like a big marketing pitch. It really does come from the point of view of the people who have to do it. So that's our value prop, and that's what we do. All right, so the purpose of this is to talk about our own journey, not only to OIE, but then everything that comes down from that, all the features we enabled. So this journey of ours starts when I first joined Okta, which was early 2021. And let's see, next slide, please. Oh, there we go. Looks like I jumped the gun, but hey, it's all good because we're going to get right there. But I want to spend a little bit of time with less slide content on this, but the OIE upgrade was the first real project the Okta and Okta team took on that really contributed back to how the product operated. We wanted to be the first people to upgrade to OIE, and our job was to figure out a way to do it in a way that would not cripple the Okta business. So that included drilling, discovering the choreography, working with product and engineering to figure out the order of operations from both the tenant side and the feature flag side to make that execution happen. And then once we figured that out and cataloged it, well, now we got to make sure we can safely roll back. And so we just drilled with them for roll back, roll forward until we got it down pat, and we turned all those findings over to product. So now, our journey to OIE was arduous in ways that ideally no customer would ever experience again, because what we did informed the tooling and the automation to help all y'all make your similar journeys. That said, the tenant level changes that occasionally have to happen, those naturally lend themselves to some, enterprise change management strategies and questions, which we're always happy to talk about. But in terms of what it got us, Well, FastPass was clearly the killer app in my recollection there. Everyone wanted it because, well, passwordless is very attractive. And this was the major feature gated behind OIE. So after we released it and we got our product penetration for FastPass, we let it soak for a year, and then we could start kind of doing some analysis on how it impacted our business. After 1 full year of having released FastPass here at Okta, a full half of our authentication events in the tenant were using it. That's a pretty significant proportion for a new authenticator to get adopted that fast. Next. Within a year, a full 75% of our authentication events in our tenant use a passwordless technology, be it WebAuthn or FastPass itself. Next. And given the FastPass sign-on experience compared to a traditional MFA flow is about 1/3 as long, you can kind of calculate based on the count of authentication events into your tenant how much time has saved. We found in that first year, we saved about 7,700 person hours. And if you figure out what that actually costs in terms of the opportunity cost cumulatively, you start saying that, hey, in that first year, we incredibly say that we've saved about $473,000 in time savings. And that's not even factoring out the other ways one could slice and dice this in terms of, yeah, we'll go into that story a little bit more later. But okay, so I know it's kind of weird for me to be here and saying, all right, here's what we accomplished in that year. And this story is like, what, already a year old? Not really. We decided that more than just passwordless, we wanted to go proper phishing resistant and really exorcise passwords out of our user experience and eventually the product itself over the next bit. Next slide, please. So in late 2022, we were approached by product and security, and we embarked on a program that we called Steel Curtain. And the mission was to relentlessly drive those passwords out. And so, like any data-driven company, we cooked up our metrics to try to check it and find where we were going if we were trending positively. And here's the metrics we had over the course of that year. So through not just us having to do the enterprise change management of adjusting our policies, evaluating all the applications and kind of reclassifying them with security to make sure that they're matched with a policy that is commensurate to their level of sensitivity to the business. We also then figured out how we could then layer on what security features, what authentication experiences are we going to offer at each one of those assurance levels. So it was a massive swirling effort that wasn't just to drive out passwords, but it was to reevaluate how we're going to monitor, do our policy structures here at Okta, and also how we can continuously layer on additional product features and security. So in partnership with product security engineering and my team Okta and Okta, we saw some pretty good advancements. So next slide, please. In the second year, we drove utilization of FastPass up to 91% of every authentication event in the tenant. That is probably unheard of levels of uniformity in authentication, barring, well, in any place where you have multiple authenticators. Next. We've got the count of specific authentication events inside of our tenant to use not just a passwordless, but a phishing resistant technology like FastPass phishing resistance or WebAuthn 97% of the time. So far and away, most of those authentication events, we're now using a phishing resistant authenticator. Next. And because of the way OIE works, more and more authentication events are being logged, but only the same amount were still being experienced by our people. So we're getting additional levels, assurance and sign-on events without necessarily impacting the user experience. And that yields about 36,000 person hours saved. Now, you might notice that saving 36,000 person hours only upped our annual guesstimate on our business value prop based on time savings to 940,000. That's because I calculated these for the authentication events the users actually see. I've since been challenged by some folk here to do some analysis on all those events you didn't see and come up with a different number. Once those get past legal, I guarantee you'll be hearing about them from your field teams or even myself. So I think this is a pretty robust story because I'm of the opinion that the business or the language of business is money. No matter what you do, no matter how passionate you are about technology, security, identity, or anything, there is, and even in an organization that sells identity security, mind you, the way to get people's attention is to convert what your passion is into a notion of how it affects the bottom line, which is why I always push these stories, and I would invite those who are trying to convince their own business stakeholders to emphasize that there's some meaningful savings and security posture enhancement that can be derived from. Next. All right, so some of you may have noticed I was playing a little bit of a rhetorical trick there when I said every authentication event in our tenant, or what percentage of authentication events in our tenant used a passwordless or phishing resistant authenticator. And you are very clever people, so you know that it's not an authentication event per se that gets access to a resource. It is the fulfillment of a policy. And if you have a policy that does not allow a phishing, that only has phishable credentials, then you're not really, you're still pretty vulnerable. The trick is figuring that out manually, the same way we were able to pull authentication events, was a huge lift, something that we were very candid with the product team about. We can't necessarily gather this telemetry easily. And that gave us an idea, because if it was a challenge for us, it was going to be a challenge for our customers who want to assess their own security posture in the same way. So as a result, and as was announced at Octane, we cooked up this phishing resistance score, and it'll be, I believe, rolling out in, I think, Q1 next year as an early access feature for people. But here's how we're tracking this now. This gives us our phishing resistance score, and it weighs your auth policies, how often resources are accessed via a phishing resistant authenticator, your policies for modifying and enrolling and unenrolling authenticators. And it gives you kind of a cumulative score here. And I know it's a little iffy for me to go up here with an overall score of about 68 of 100 and say, look at us, we've made such big strides since we moved to OIE. But that's kind of where the granular data really helps. Like our login and authentication policy scores are actually surprisingly high. And if you take a look at the interaction and application phishing resistance scores, you see what percentage of sign-ons into those events or those resources used a phishing resistant policy, and you see that they're hanging up there in the high 90s. Now, I'm also going to be transparent that our journey here isn't over yet. What we accomplished was very specifically, we got rid of using passwords to access our resources in the okta.okta.com tenant. Obviously, we're going to not want to stop until we can be phishing resistant across the entire life cycle of accounts here at Okta of all species. And so the story for the next year is going to be us continuing to press that advantage, make and feedback and test the product changes that are going to let us accomplish that and share those stories. So I look forward to continuing to iterate on this, because, you know, as fun as it is to hype and market certain things, at the end of the day, it is that iteration that is going to yield the superior security outcome. So stay tuned to this space. We're going to be dropping more stuff on the Okta and Okta blog as we roll. All right, next up. All right, so I had mentioned that we had enabled some additional policy structures or features as part of OIE to kind of heighten our security at sign-on time. Next one, please. These were layered in before we really focused on our phishing resistant story, but it's, again, the entire point. The reason why I emphasize iteration is because, like, adding all these things one at a time, there's a significant enterprise change management and unexpected outcomes that you may have to prepare for. So making these changes is a big swing all at once. You know, in my experience, potentially ill-advised. And so we started layering these things on little by little. And the first one was our behavioral detection policies. It just gets a baseline for how someone signs in, the context for their sign-in. And in the extent that if there's something outside of a statistical range, like a brand new IP address, a different geolocation, then we increase the challenge to that sign-on. Next one, please. Yep. So here we go. Here's a very simple diagram that I like to walk through with people. So, I mean, as expected, if your behavioral detection is within tolerances, then you get the most low friction experience that we'll offer for whatever the security rating of the resource you're accessing is. So lower friction. But, and I say this as someone who flies to San Francisco from Richmond, Virginia an awful lot, my first sign-on is usually a little bit more intense because now I'm outside of my statistical norm. But instead of getting blocked, because we don't want to block people, air travel is part and parcel of modern business, No, we just want to have them sign in with a higher assurance authenticator. Now, fortunately, since we're already using phishing resistant and a lot of things for most of our applications, phishing resistant and platform bound authenticators, the step up isn't nearly as intense as it used to be. So it's kind of fascinating that we've been able to roll ourselves into a higher assurance, but still low friction model, while still also using this behavioral detection to detect anomalies. Next one, please. All right, so Okta device context. I thought this was probably one of the most significant game changers in terms of how we can apply policies, because a lot of stuff flows from it. For those in the know, you get a native device posture-like capabilities, care of OIE using Okta device context. And if you have managed devices like that are administrated via an endpoint management system, then you can pair that endpoint management and the confidence that comes from having a healthy, well-managed asset with all the security policies and software and patches applied with then your Okta certificate administrator, your certificate admin certificate authority. There we go. That's the word. Your certificate authority in the tenant to push down a device cert for device-based auth. So what that gets you is now you have this notion of a managed device, and this managed device and the signals you get from it will help inform if what resources they can access. Let's see. So yeah, here's how it works. Pretty obvious. If the device has a certificate, go ahead. You get in because the policy dictates that you're going to need that device certificate, particularly for the sensitive applications where we're only going to want an Okta managed device to access that data. Now, if a device doesn't have a certificate, naturally they'll be blocked. But I've got to put a little asterisk here because I think this is one of the coolest things here is care of Okta Verify. You're able to introduce this concept of a registered device. It's not managed, but what you get is some telemetry based on that Okta Verify installation, and having authenticated the user and enrolling it with Okta Verify, you've now bound that device to that user, but not to the same level of assurance as you did if you were pushing a certificate and its endpoint was managed. We don't have any MDM on our mobile devices here at Okta, but there's clearly a lot of business need and opportunity to make sure that people are able to work in the field and be productive. So we want to enable them, but also not expose our data. So that registered layer lets us find that middle ground for those productivity apps where we want to get some sort of telemetry on the device and have some level of assurance that what we have is, managed device policies, that what we have is, at least a device in good hygiene. And we get interesting stuff that don't necessarily have slides for, such as at sign on time, we're able to see some very basic telemetry, like the device OS version. Is it encrypted? Does it have a lock screen? Some very, very basic security hygiene that is much better to understand if you're going to allow bring your own device type use cases. And more importantly, then each one of those gives us the granularity to start enforcing security policies to access resources on those devices. We can't change the device. They're not owned by us. But what we can do is tighten our policy that says if you're like 1 point release from the latest iOS or Android, well, then you don't get in until you update. And where, I think for both device context for managed and unmanaged devices, my guidance for people who implement it on their own for managed would be anticipate a temporary spike in your help desk engagement, right? This is if once you start binding your device management and your authentication policies, then things that are actually an endpoint issue, like it's no longer checking in, it doesn't have the right version of whatever, they start looking like identity issues. So you need to make sure you have a good partnership with your help desk or your desktop support function to make sure that they understand when this change is going in, what the things they're going to need to check for and fix, so that way that endpoint can then access it. Otherwise, you're going to get crushed under a wave of things that are outside of your control. All right, next, please. All right, so we're CrowdStrike customers here, and for our most sensitive applications, actually all applications, what we do is a little bit of a we look to them for their security signaling and weigh that into our authentication as well. So in endpoint that is managed, and we have the CrowdStrike agent, we're able to tighten the policy thresholds to say, if CrowdStrike says this gets an arbitrary CrowdStrike score of 60, we're not going to let it into this resource. But if it's sufficiently healthy, let's say an arbitrary CrowdStrike score of 80, then we can. And as I've seen this roll out, it's more like we figure out how to gradually tighten those tolerances as we start seeing that penetration in our environment. And then we have yet another, in fact, even a third-party person taking a look at our security and telemetry and providing a second set of eyes, so to speak, on the health and security of devices that are accessing your resources here. Next. All right, so layering all these things on, and here at Okta, like, we want to use all the things available to us, because as Okta and Okta, we want to be the people to kind of do it and show it. But for whatever your particular use case is, you can pick and choose these. But one thing that I think is important to highlight is care of that iteration of rolling out new security features into our policies, embedding them into our policies, moving towards phishing and resistance. You start to see a bit of a pattern here, because now we're authenticating the user. We're authenticating them very strongly, in fact, using a phishing-resistant device-bound credential. We're also now authenticating the device. And even the devices we don't manage, we're still getting those unmanaged device signals to understand if they're a risk to let into our environment. And we consider things like those signals using both the Okta Verify and managed device signals and managed device signals, behavioral detection, and CrowdStrike to evaluate the context of that sign-on. Now, if you understand the textbook definition of what zero trust architecture is, you're authenticating your user, your device, evaluating the context under which that access happens. And as long as you have some sort of governance policy to re-evaluate and constantly tighten those policies, well, congratulations. You've just, accomplished a pretty defendable position of being, a zero trust architecture type place, according to NIST. So I think that's been one of the cooler things. Was I'm sure a very smart person who wasn't me or so focused on the implementation knew exactly what they were doing here and drove us towards this direction. But, at the end of the day, we had to do it and then take the help desk calls when we found something that was a little too rough. So that's more or less my piece. And I invite you all to go to questions.
All right. Thank you very much, John. That was an excellent overview. And I see we've had a number of questions coming in. Before we dive into the audience questions, I did have one question I wanted to address with you, and that's really kind of around the process of well, so you talked about the process of the upgrade, which obviously is somewhat unique for Okta in that we were the guinea pigs, and there really wasn't any automation at the time when we did it. But I want to talk about more of the sort of change management process around both the upgrade from classic engine to identity engine, as well as the rollout of specific features like FastPass or some of the device context stuff. We've touched on these things in previous sessions from a technical standpoint, but maybe you could speak to sort of the change control, like end user comms type of strategies that you've found to be useful or maybe not useful or what have you.
So I guess for context, my background here is I've been nearly 20 years working in enterprise identity of one species or another. And that included some very large companies that were definitely not identity shops or software shops, but identity was, what we own there. I've only been at Okta for, we're closing in on 3 years now, but this is the first time I've been like, wearing vendor colors, so to speak, while thinking in terms of being a practitioner. Now, an interesting thing I've seen in speaking with customers these days is there seems like there's a little bit of allergy to over communication. Communication seems like an unwinnable game to people in technology because you said too much, people aren't just going to glance right off of it. You don't say enough, well, now you're on the hook because you failed your change management. You didn't prep people for it. I would way rather irritate people with excessive communication than not, because I've seen what happens when you try to go one way or the other, and the outcomes are generally a lot better if you just inundate with communications. This means like saying, okay, here is what it is. Here's how you can test if you're going to be okay using this test app. Here is what you can do if your test didn't work okay. Giving plenty of lead time and not being so reactive that your release window is like, 2 days after you finally complete user acceptance testing, how about give yourself the kind of lead time to make that change authoritative and have all your stakeholders on board? I know we tend to go a mile a minute in technology, but some things really merit a little bit of breathing room, especially enterprise change control, because not everybody's a technologist. They're not going to have the interest or patience to read up on the latest new feature coming out. And that happens even here at Okta. So I will emphasize again, putting yourselves in front of your internal customers, whoever your business stakeholders, the closest ones you work with, try to partner with them as, as another avenue through which to disseminate this information. Because I recall being, just some little peanut admin somewhere at a very big company and struggling to get people's attention. I eventually learned how to bring in and get some kind of executive championship and stakeholders to deliver that message perhaps a little bit more prominently than I was able to do. But yeah, I think just comms, trainings, whatever mechanisms you have to disseminate information for your business, do it. I think some sort of FAQ page is a tool I've used to great success in other organizations. Just so that way you can immediately pivot people to a place where they can find all that information without having to interrupt your data to ask something. Hopefully that answered your question. If not, anything you want me to pull deeper on, just go for it.
No, absolutely, it did. So you mentioned the test app in particular. I recall when we were getting ready to roll out FastPass here, there was a specific test app that got rolled out to everyone where you could hit that specific application. It would test your Okta Verify configuration to make sure you're ready for FastPass. Can you talk a little bit about the for anyone who's maybe not familiar with that technique, like how you go about isolating that to a particular application or creating that sort of test application setup?
So in terms of the technology behind it, whatever your technical stack is probably the best way to do it. But what you need is a web resource that will be protected by Okta, and then that application set up and issued to everybody. So however you choose to set up this little test app or make it a SAML or an OpenID Connect consumer, that's ultimately up to you. But the look was, and what we did was we filmed a demo of here's the test. Here's how you click it. Here's what it looks like if it works. Here's what it looks like if it doesn't. And here's where you go for help if it doesn't. Yeah. And then, so people, before they even got that, could actually see the expected flows and see the changes in the UX. And then we just own the policy and then rolling that app out. And then it's up to people for themselves, if they're curious, to test it out. And, we pay attention to how often and who has accessed it. And we can use that with something like workplace technology support or desktop support to then hound people down, depending on how much handholding you want to do in your business. But that's the thrust of that kind of testing. It's honestly not something that I've ever done in any other organization, but I think it's definitely what I consider now a much better or best practice.
Awesome. All right. So I know we have a number of questions coming in. Dimitri, do you want to bring some of the audience questions to us?
Yes, I think that related to what you guys just discussed, there's a question about the overall end user impact. So what the end users see and how do they react to the changes that OI brings, and does that represent an issue? So your comment, John, on that would be helpful, I believe.
All right. So if I understood, the question was how. Yeah, could you go pass it by me one more time?
End user impact.
Okay.
See different widgets, different way to reset their password, those kind of things.
So I will say one of the major tailwinds I do have here at Okta is people knew these changes were coming for the most part, and they were very excited about them. So things like rolling out FastPass for us was great. The thing we had to worry about was making sure that everybody could and had all the tools in order to be successful after our rollout to use it. I think that said, we have rolled out a whole lot of additional features and things which perhaps were less well received, even though they were well communicated ahead of time. And in that regard, I'm going to say, depending on how your structure's organized, the best way to do that is, not just as part of the comms, because, let's be honest, you can over communicate, but it's still up to the person to actually glide their eyes over those comms. But people like to know why of change an awful lot. And what comes across as complaints is often just people wanting to be informed, understanding, like perhaps your user experience has the potential to introduce a little bit more friction in the name of security, but rather than say, okay, now complain enough about this and roll it back, instead you could say, well, we decided that we're going to eliminate this thing out of our system because we're going to get this business value because of it. And here's the user experience, and please give us feedback if it actually blocks you, not just if you don't like it. So I think, again, communication, having a line for your customers to reach out to you, your internal customers. Like we have the all Okta and Okta channel where people can ask those kind of questions. It's not so much a support channel, but people want to know, and people can also issue or surface issues that perhaps are a little bit more fringe that way. So hopefully that answered that.
Okay. Got it. So before we get into some questions that are more specific, there is one general question that you can probably comment on, Jon, and Brent, you might be able to add as well as you talk to a lot of customers. So the question is, what are some of the top pain point customers experience when upgrading to OIE from Classic? So did we encounter one at Okta first? And Brent, maybe if you can comment some of the most classic things that we see. Seems to be a good concern from the audience.
So at Okta, our pain points was we knew about the changes in how authentication policies worked and factor chaining and all that stuff. So we did a lot of pre-work to figure out what our policies would look like in our OIE world compared to Classic. So we were able to sidestep that. But that has been something I've heard a lot from customers. They really like this certain order of operations at sign-on, and they don't want to give up that. Or I think that's mainly it. And even that's not nearly as much of a complaint they pop up as you'd think. I think the other item is a handful of folk, using the classic Okta device management module. I honestly forget what it's called, but we found we still had a whole lot of people enrolled in it, and we had no idea what would happen if we upgraded and they were still enrolled. So I think now our guidance is, okay, if people are still using that, make sure you unenroll before. I personally never saw what happened if we let people behind there. I imagine some people in the tenant were left behind, but they haven't yelled too loudly. But that's been the only other thing that has surfaced. And those are like the two most well-known items. In my experience, honestly, the biggest thing that is a hindrance to adoption is probably inertia. I think people feel like this is a more dramatic change than it needs to be or can be. And so barring those situations where perhaps there's a regulatory reason why you have to have a certain order of operations at sign-on time, most of the hiccups here are fully alleviated by just planning out what your new policies are going to be, making sure you already understand what your current stable of apps are and how they're going to map into those new policies, and getting alignment from your security and business change people to make sure that these new policies are really going to be the way you're going to do it, and then do it. Like this strikes to me as a very low effort lift these days that folks still imagine is much harder than it is in reality, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I guess the other thing I would add to that in terms of I guess in terms of issues that customers have brought to me anyway from some of the office hour sessions that have done are just some of the subtle changes to the look and flow of the login, the first time the users log in after upgrade. So specifically things like the slight change to the screen where your enrolled authenticators are presented. First time users log in after upgrade, it doesn't remember the last one that you used like it had been previously in Classic. It'll present you with all of your enrolled factors, which, depending on your user population, any even small change like that can be somewhat, I guess, disconcerting to some users. So just being aware of those types of things and communicating it to end users, I think that's the only other thing that I've seen, or the biggest thing that I've seen, or most frequent comment that I've seen.
Great. So related to the upgrade, we've talked about the end user experience. I want to ask Jon also a question about the kind of the admin experience, because we know from presenting to our customers that there's a new policy framework, there's differences with factor sequencing between Classic and OIE. So how quickly did the Okta admin cope to the new way that is done in OIE, and what was their learning curve? Did they just look at the videos online? So what's the admin experience of the upgrade is the question.
I would say in the pre-work running up to the actual cutover to OIE from Classic, and all the amount of drilling we did for building these policies, because nothing was automated then, they were pretty well versed in how things operated by the time we actually did our cutover. And whereas we did I'm not going to say that they would not have had an issue going into that, but I think just understanding the difference between global policies and application policies and all of those things is probably going to be like the biggest shock to somebody who perhaps doesn't fully understand like the full breadth and scope of what identity offers care of that product, and perhaps are looking at it as more like an administrative perspective. As ticket comes in, I put these values in, and ticket goes out. So to say that, my impression was that this was not a dramatic or difficult change in terms of how to approach it. I would say our policies get very verbose with all the additional rules and capabilities we have, and we have to test those an awful lot. But if anything, I think that was probably something that always should have happened. And so now any policy that comes in production has been like triple vetted by all the appropriate stakeholders and then relentlessly function tested. And I've been in organizations where we certainly didn't do that.
Got it. I want to jump back to a couple of details questions on your side, Jon. There was a question about your side with metrics on phishing resistant and password. What year was that? Because the year was cut off. I guess that was 2022 or 2021, right?
Yeah, so I shared first, so piggy metric number 1, the smaller piggy bank. There you go. That was from, keep going. Oh, keep on going. Perfect. All right, here we go. All right, so this is August 2022, and perhaps just me having been in this story, I tend to forget that those following along don't have the intrinsic knowledge to it. So August 2021 is when we upgraded and released FastPass, and these were our metrics after letting it soak for the first year, and then the next set of piggy metrics, those stem from. Let's go to the next piggy metrics. It makes a little more sense that way. There you go. These ones are from 2 years after that. And it looks like I need to update this deck because time makes fools of us all. And the last time I did put it out there was today. But yeah, so that's 2 years post. And then also our emphasis on trying to get to a phishing resistant posture and really driving those metrics. And then the last one, the graph slide, there you go. This is how we're tracking it now. And this is kind of like our evolved thoughts and the evolved tools we have to track our phishing resistant security story here at Okta. So this is, I believe this screenshot was from right before Octane. I have a snapshot of this being sent to me every day, and we've already made tenant changes that have changed these values. And so I watch the trend lines and they go up, but I have to look at it in Tableau because this is like the primordial version of what's going to be baked into the product and then presented much more slickly for admins in the next year.
Yeah. And I think just to follow up on that, I think you mentioned in your earlier presentation, but did we have a ballpark EA or ETA on when this can be expected to be seen in the product itself?
If my memory from Octane holds, I believe it's going to be in early access in Q1 of the next calendar year.
Yeah.
But safe harbor, all that jazz.
Right. Yeah, but I guess the key point here is that this metric that you're looking at here is going to be coming to the product. So eventually you will be able to have this type of metric visible to you automatically in the product as well. So be on the lookout for that.
And for the sake of curiosity, there's also a question: how did you get your metrics about phishing resistant? Did you use Splunk, or how do you gather the data of adoption and usage?
So the very first things, we literally use tenant data. And because, the only thing we could pull was authentication events, we saw them all classified as, FastPass with a phishing resistant flag on it. In fact, I have the queries published, and we've shared them with customers. So if you were an existing customer, hit your field person and you can go through that. But it's really just as easy as querying on all the authenticator types in your environment and making sure you subtract the non-phishing resistant transactions from the phishing resistant transactions, and then you can track the count of authentication events which are phishing resistant. But I just got to reemphasize that was definitely much more. That's an obsolete model now. Now we're looking at this, and this has been piled from. Honestly, I think we needed some dedicated product people to figure out how to tie the authentication event to the policy evaluation and then be able to cook this up. So I think this represents some significant effort on behalf of our product team that first is being presented in Tableau. But yeah, so it takes a lot of effort to really tie a phishing resistant policy fulfillment to a specific action. And I'm glad that we now have a dashboard to do it for us.
Outstanding. I think I heard you say you had some queries that were published somewhere. Is that in the blog that's published, or?
No, I haven't published them in the blog.
Okay.
I've given them to various customers who have
Okay.
had questions about it. These are very basic Okta queries, and I don't believe there've been anything sensitive to them. So
Okay.
I could probably share some examples, and then you could derive what to do with the rest of the way from there.
Gotcha. So on the subject of the blog, though, maybe this is a good opportunity to plug the Okta on Okta blog. We haven't really talked about that much. Do you want to talk a little bit about what the Okta on Okta blog is? Maybe we can throw the link in the chat window and you can get a plug there.
Yeah. So in alignment with our third mission, which is to showcase what we're doing, we want to tell more of our stories, because even the simple things like that, like, hey, here's how we used to calculate that, and then including the simple queries we do that enough, or perhaps every single, at the end of every sprint, we blog about what we've released and our experiences doing it. You do that, eventually that's a big compendium of high quality data for other administrators to look at and get a feel for. And more importantly, by the time it hits out, it'll be punched up, sounding a lot cooler than if a tech nerd wrote it. And also it'll be vetted by legal, so I can be utterly transparent about anything on that blog by the time it's published out there.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So that blog is, if we don't have it in the, I don't know where to type that, but okta.com/Okta on Okta.
I'll throw it in there.
And actually, I'm going to write down that query, because that's a good blog article. Yeah.
That's Okta on Okta, no dashes or anything, just all.
Correct. Okta.com/Okta on Okta.
All right. That should be in the chat window for everyone if you want to give that a look as well. So lots of good information there. Speaking of blogs and community site, we had a couple of questions that came in ahead of time from the community side. I want to make sure we address some of those. One of them is around like what your recommendations would be for sort of the top post OIE upgrade features to implement in terms of user impacts, whether that's impact on user experience or security posture or whatever. I have a feeling I kind of know, but can you talk about what's some of the most impactful OIE features are, or if you have like a specific I don't know if there's a specific like sort of order of rollout that you would recommend or that you found useful?
I would say if from an order of operations perspective, getting FastPass out there and socialized is good as an authenticator. But the question is, can you roll it out as a phishing resistant form? Since we have unmanaged phishing resistant support for FastPass, that barrier to entry, and actually every platform, it doesn't need to be a managed device for you to be able to achieve phishing resistant authentication. So I'd say FastPass, because if you've successfully rolled out FastPass, you might as well roll it out first with phishing resistance. That feature didn't exist when we first rolled ours out, but I will say that flipping it over once we had all the pieces, all the support for unmanaged a device access across every platform using FastPass, that was tremendously low impact. It was fantastic. So like, yeah, and now that you don't need to wait for this phishing resistant capability to be available like we did, then yeah, you could do it straight out of bed. So I'd say FastPass phishing resistant first and foremost, because your users will love you for it. It hems a lot of issues at sign-on time. And then the next one in terms of the potential is going to be Okta device context. Whether you're managed or unmanaged or not, or anything, even getting telemetry on your registered unmanaged devices and being able to filter out what applications should be accessible under certain contexts, you just start having a whole lot more tools in your tool belt in terms of policy enforcement that will overall improve your security posture as an organization. Because now you can start driving people into maintaining their phones if they're not managed versus pushing out a patch if they were. So it's kind of one of those fun things you can use to kind of judo your organization into a better security posture without them fully appreciating or even resenting that initiative.
Yeah. So on the topic of FastPass and phishing resistant authentication, so obviously we've on the Okta, I guess within the product we have FastPass or WebAuthn as phishing resistant options. Can you speak to like pros and cons of one versus the other, or any recommendations you would have on like emphasizing FastPass versus WebAuthn or vice versa? Like,
So I think the important thing to recognize here is that you can have a phishing resistant sign-on that does not also include either a biometric or a device-bound authenticator. Well, actually, I believe it is device-bound no matter what because of the Okta Verify install. So actually, it'll be device-bound no matter what, but you don't necessarily have to have a second factor, which the biometric prompt during a Touch ID interaction with FastPass is. So you could, like, even our low assurance apps phishing resistant. Now, from the, they use the same secure enclave, the WebAuthn flow, as well as Okta Verify's own keys. So from an apples to apples comparison, you don't seem to gain much over one or the other. And now that browsers and operating systems have caught up, a lot of laptops have platform authenticators, and then those can be registered in the browsers as FIDO2 tokens. And in fact, anecdotally, the experience or the ceremony looks very similar. It's just the question is, are you going to get an Okta Verify prompt that you then respond to with Touch ID, or are you going to get a browser prompt that you then respond to with Touch ID? So figure out, I mean, they're both going to provide you device-bound, phishing resistant, and multi-factor capabilities. So they're both good from strong off. Figure out what is best for your environment. What can your fleet actually support? And what, is your browser experience, like, is it going to be better than the Okta Verify experience, or vice versa? If you're in an organization that has to use some poor deprecated version of a browser for a handful of super critical ERP apps or something, well, then, you're probably going to want to take that into consideration too as part of your sign-on flow. So it'll matter from place to place. As somebody wearing team colors now, of course, I'm going to push FastPass. It's cool.
Right.
But from like the pure security and identity practitioner perspective, it's like they both accomplish the same ends. The question is, okay, what matches your own business's use case?
Awesome. All right. Dimitri, do we have any other?
There's a request from the audience for Jon to speak more about Okta Verify for desktop authentication, the implementation of that, the rollout of that.
All right, so I believe this is not just having Okta Verify installed on a desktop type endpoint, which we also have and is also required for the FastPass experience. Rather, it is using Okta Device Access, I believe, unless we've changed the name for that yet again, to actually sign in using your Okta credential on the desktop. Is it the latter?
That's both actually. That was the next one. I was also seeing in the audience a lot of questions about Okta Device Access. So if you can comment on both, that would be great.
All right, so Okta Verify on the desktop, it's the same premise as Okta Verify on any other device. On here at Okta, our endpoint devices, our desktops are managed, so we have to install Okta Verify. We push the latest version of Okta Verify, and as part of onboarding, we make this one of the first authenticators that they bootstrap. And then it's our default authenticator. So we don't necessarily need to rely on those the unmanaged device signals, because we already have all the other telemetry and security tooling on that endpoint. But there was a time where you could install Okta Verify on a personal desktop, and before we changed our policies, I did. I mean, I think it's a point of never mind. I'm just gonna say I did, and then again, we had a registered. I had a device registered to me, like my personal laptop, that I could use to hit the apps that were accessible from an unmanaged endpoint. Eventually, we decided to tighten our security position such that, if it's going to be a full-fledged desktop, then we're not, even though they're barred by policy from accessing our most sensitive resources, we still only want to allow access from an Okta device, full stop. So that's where we're at today. Now, in terms of the Okta Device Access, or being able to sign in using your Okta managed credentials, that is something that we are we're kicking the tires on, and we already have. So we've given all of our early access feedback, and now we're looking at a potential rollout here at Okta in this quarter. Now, I may have some competing priorities, and that may get delayed a little bit, but I assure you, we're very eager to use this, and what's more, use improvements to it over time so we can move forward on our fully phishing resistant story. And Okta Device Access is going to have a big part to play in that over time. But for right now, yeah, we've looked at it for months and months and months, and it's good. It's just a matter of prioritizing the rollout versus competing priorities.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
Now,
sorry, go ahead, Dimitri.
Yeah, we don't look at device access. I think there's one last question we could cover.
Okay.
So yeah, because you spent quite some time talking about device context and the upgrade from device trust to device context. There's a couple of comments asking that it is a bit challenging in terms of how to deploy that. So any word on wisdom on how to approach this upgrade from device trust to device context to really take the full benefit of the capabilities?
So here's where the constant changing terminology of the product and our involvement very early in it, because when I think Okta Device Trust, I think of the capability that was launched at OIE, which we are now referring to as Okta Device Context, or Okta Device Context. So is Okta Device Trust in this context, is it referring to the same feature, or is it referring to a capability which exists only in Classic now?
It's referring how it used to work in Classic, where it was pretty straightforward. You only connected to the MDM, so you didn't have to use the SCP option and all those kind of stuff. Basically, the deployment of device context, word of wisdom on how to organize that and be successful at doing that. Because there's many moving parts. There's Okta Verify, there's an MDM solution, there might be an EDR solution. So how to put all this together practically and without falling into the complexity.
So yeah, that was ultimately the thing. I'm not going to say we stumbled on, but it was the late breaking thing that we had to address as part of our own OIE upgrade. And that's where we had several, even though we weren't necessarily using Okta Device Trust policies in Classic any longer, there was still a significant population. So we'd already removed those policies. And then we just had to have people make sure they remove the profiles from their local devices because we didn't understand what would happen if they upgraded. So in terms of the actual order of operations and everything going on there, I'm unaware what was providing the MDM endpoint piece of that. But what I can say pretty confidently was, as someone who is aware of how difficult PKI can be in certain organizations, that I own a certificate authority now, and I haven't had to think about it once. I'm big props to our product team for giving me a big piece of identity infrastructure in the tenant that seems to be kind of fire and forget in that regard. So I don't want to downplay the real challenges of having to do that upgrade or migration. I just have to say that in my own experience and the experience of our team, we didn't quite have those same considerations, but we have now marched forward using Okta Device Context with multiple endpoint providers, testing with other endpoint management providers. So it seemed very low effort to me. I'm sorry I don't have a very good story around how to successfully do that. I would certainly hope that our field teams and enablement teams probably have some playbooks for best practice for that by now. And if not, there's an opportunity for some Okta and Okta blogs.
Right. All right. We're coming up on, we're close to the end of our time. There was one other question that came in beforehand from our community site that I wanted to throw out there. I don't know if you have any, if we had to deal with this at all internally in our transition to OIE, but there was a question around the approach to migrating the AWS CLI client from Classic to OIE. And obviously there's the new OIE version of the CLI client that you migrate to post upgrade, but that client only works on OIE and doesn't work on Classic. So there's a question around, what's the most streamlined approach to that migration. Is that something that we dealt with at all here? Or if not, I can kind of speak to what I've seen from other customers.
I cannot recall this being something we had to solve for in our own journey. That's not to say it's not a real pain point.
Yeah. So I guess the thing that I've seen, and obviously for most customers, it's probably just going to be a matter of, it's just going to be a transition of, a matter of transitioning to a new tool. The one approach that I saw from one customer that actually did make it pretty streamlined, at least for their end users, was they actually already had an in-house built CLI that they were using that was essentially a proxy over one of the third party. I forget if it was Gimme Creds or what the other third party CLI was that they were proxying over, but essentially they just updated their own internal CLI proxy to take into account the new Okta tool. And I forget exactly all the details of exactly how it was checking, but they actually built logic into that tool to determine whether or not they were pointing to an OIE tenant or a Classic tenant, and then they mapped to the appropriate CLI accordingly. So that's one scenario that actually made it pretty seamless, at least to end users, but obviously that's probably not something that would apply to everyone. It worked for that customer because they already had that in place in Classic, but otherwise it's probably just going to be one of those things similar to the mobile device trust, where you just kind of have to have a little bit of a change window and migrate to the new tool. All right, so looking at the time, we are at the end of the hour. Jon, I want to thank you again for joining us today. This has been very informative and very helpful. Thanks so much for your time. Dimitri, as well as the rest of my colleagues who've been curating the questions, thank you guys. And for obviously for all of our attendees who joined us, thanks for joining us today. We will be posting the recording of this, as well as there's no, all the slides are public, right? So there's no issue with posting those slides. If not,
I think by definition, yes, I believe they are. All the metrics, better said, have been thoroughly vetted by legal at this point.
All right, good deal. Yeah, so we'll post the recording of this as well as the slide deck once we have that sanitized and ready to go. But again, thanks to everyone for joining us. I do want to call out some resources that are out there for you. I posted those in the chat window for OIE upgrades as well as OIE features. There's a number of resources there that are at your disposal. So feel free to take advantage of those. And be on the lookout for the next session coming up. Not sure of an exact date. It'll either be sometime in November, maybe before the Thanksgiving holiday, or if not, then maybe early December after everyone gets back from the holidays. We're trying to work out schedules with all the holidays coming up, but be on the lookout for the next session. We're looking at doing something on Okta device access, which was a topic that came up today. So be on the lookout for that. Thanks again, everyone. And we'll call it a day for this session, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.